Hi, I'm Rebecca Martinez. 6 months ago, I thought I understood what family meant. I believed that becoming a mother would somehow heal the complicated relationship I'd always had with my own mother, Elena. I imagined that my 3-year-old daughter, Emma, would be the bridge that finally brought us together as 3 generations of women who could support and love each other unconditionally. I was wrong about everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What I discovered at my daughter's 3rd birthday party would shatter not just my illusions about family, but reveal a pattern of behavior so disturbing that my husband, a Pentagon chief of staff, would use his considerable influence to ensure there were consequences that reached far beyond hurt feelings and family drama. But before I tell you how a children's birthday party became the catalyst for justice at the highest levels of government, let me take you back to where the story really begins. Because what happened that sunny Saturday afternoon in our backyard in Arlington, Virginia, wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of 3 years of escalating boundary violations that I'd been too exhausted, too hopeful, and too afraid to address directly. The morning of March 18th started like any other Saturday in our neighborhood. The cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom along the Potomac, and the air carried that crisp spring promise that makes Washington, D.C. feel like a city of infinite possibilities. I'd been up since 5:30 a.m., transforming our backyard into what I hoped would be Emma's perfect 3rd birthday celebration. I'm not naturally a party planner. My background is in cybersecurity analysis for government contractors, and I'm much more comfortable debugging network vulnerabilities than coordinating balloon arrangements and cake deliveries. But Emma had been talking about her princess castle party for weeks, and I'd been determined to make her vision come to life. The theme was elaborate. Pink and purple everywhere, with a bounce house shaped like a fairy tale castle, professional face painting, and a magician who specialized in preschooler entertainment. I'd invited 12 of Emma's little friends from daycare, along with their parents, plus our extended family and close friends. It was ambitious for someone who usually preferred intimate gatherings, but Emma's excitement had been infectious. My husband, Colonel David Martinez, had been deployed to Afghanistan for most of the planning process, but he'd managed to secure leave that brought him home just 2 days before the party. David serves as chief of staff to a Pentagon division that I can't discuss in detail, but his work involves coordination between military intelligence and civilian security agencies. He's the kind of person who can solve complex logistical problems under pressure while maintaining the calm, steady demeanor that made him successful in both military leadership and our marriage. David had thrown himself into party preparations with the same methodical efficiency he brought to coordinating multi-million-dollar defense operations. He'd handled all the vendor confirmations, set up the entertainment area, and even learned how to create balloon arches using YouTube tutorials during his limited downtime at the base. "This is going to be perfect," he'd said the night before, as we'd stood in our kitchen reviewing the timeline for the next day. "Emma's going to remember this party for the rest of her life." I agreed, feeling proud of what we'd accomplished together. The backyard looked magical, the weather forecast was ideal, and Emma had been practically vibrating with excitement all week. Everything was aligned for a celebration that would create the kind of joyful childhood memory that stays with you forever. But there was one variable I hadn't adequately planned for, one factor that had the potential to disrupt even the most carefully orchestrated event. My mother, Elena Rodriguez, had been living with us for the past 8 months. The arrangement had started as a temporary solution. Elena had been struggling financially after my father's death 2 years earlier, and her small apartment in Baltimore had become unaffordable on her limited Social Security income. When she'd mentioned during a phone call that she was considering moving to a senior living facility with a long waiting list, David and I immediately offered our guest room. "Family takes care of family," David had said, and I'd loved him even more for his immediate generosity toward my mother. Our house in Arlington was spacious enough to accommodate her comfortably, and I thought that having her closer would give Emma the chance to develop a real relationship with her grandmother. The reality had been more complicated than I had anticipated. Elena had opinions about everything related to Emma's care, from her bedtime routine to her diet to the toys we chose for her. She'd grown up in a generation where children were expected to be quiet, obedient, and deferential to adult authority at all times. Emma, by contrast, was a spirited, curious 3-year-old who never met a mud puddle she didn't want to explore. The clash between Elena's expectations and Emma's personality had created constant tension in our household. Elena would make disapproving comments about Emma's wild behavior when she was simply being a normal toddler. She'd criticize my parenting choices, suggesting that I was too lenient and Emma needed more discipline to become a properly behaved child. I'd tried to address these concerns through gentle conversations, explaining child development principles and the parenting approaches that David and I had chosen based on research and our pediatrician's guidance. But Elena had dismissed these discussions as evidence that modern parents were too soft and that children suffered when they weren't taught proper respect for authority. The conflicts had escalated over the months. Elena would undermine the rules David and I had established for Emma, then act surprised when Emma became confused about expectations. She'd make critical comments about Emma's behavior in front of other people, embarrassing both Emma and me. She'd offer unsolicited parenting advice to other parents at the playground, positioning herself as the voice of experience while implying that I was too inexperienced to handle my own child effectively. But I'd convinced myself that these were normal growing pains of a multi-generational household. Elena had been through a difficult period of grief and adjustment, and I'd believed that patience and understanding would eventually help her find her place in our family dynamic without constantly trying to reshape it according to her preferences. I'd also been reluctant to create conflict with David's deployment schedule, keeping him away from home for weeks at a time. Managing a toddler as essentially single parent while working full-time had been exhausting enough without adding family drama to the mix. I'd chosen to minimize Elena's behavior and focus on the positive aspects of having her help with Emma's care. The morning of the party, Elena had seemed more anxious and critical than usual. She'd commented negatively on the party decorations, suggesting they were too elaborate and would give Emma unrealistic expectations for future celebrations. She'd criticized the guest list, claiming that inviting so many children would create chaos that would be impossible to manage safely. Most concerning, she'd made several comments about Emma's outfit, a pink tulle dress that Emma had chosen herself and absolutely loved. Elena had suggested that the dress was too fancy for a backyard party and that Emma would be disappointed when it inevitably got dirty. She'd also mentioned that the dress made Emma look spoiled and might give other parents the wrong impression about our family's values. I'd deflected these criticisms while continuing with party preparations, but I'd felt a growing sense of unease about how Elena might behave once the guests arrived. Her comments hadn't been directly inappropriate, but the underlying tone suggested that she viewed the entire celebration as excessive, and Emma's excitement as something that needed to be managed rather than encouraged. David had noticed my tension and had asked if everything was okay. I'd mentioned Elena's critical comments, and he'd offered to talk with her about maintaining a positive attitude during the party. But I'd declined, not wanting to create pre-party drama that might affect the celebration. "She'll be fine once the party starts," I'd told him. "She loves Emma, and she wants the day to be special too. I think she's just nervous about having so many people in the house." Looking back, I recognized that I was making excuses for behavior that had already crossed reasonable boundaries. I was prioritizing family harmony over my own instincts about Elena's attitude toward Emma and my parenting choices. I was hoping that the joy of the celebration would naturally bring out Elena's better angels and that any conflicts could be addressed after the party was over. I was wrong about that too. The first guests arrived at 1 p.m. And for the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The children were delighted with the bounce house and face painting. The parents were relaxed and social, enjoying the beautiful weather and watching their kids play. Emma was radiant in her pink dress, moving from activity to activity with the kind of pure happiness that makes all the effort of party planning feel worthwhile.
Elena had stationed herself near the refreshment table, where she had been serving juice boxes and chatting with the other adults. She'd seemed more relaxed than she had been during the morning preparations, and I'd started to believe that my optimism about her behavior had been justified. David had been moving through the party with military precision, ensuring that every child was engaged and that no parent felt left out of conversations. He had a natural ability to connect with people that made him successful in both diplomatic and social situations, and I'd watched him charming Emma's friends and making their parents feel welcomed and appreciated. But as the party had progressed and Emma had become more excited and energetic, which was exactly what we'd hoped for at her birthday celebration, I'd noticed Elena's expression growing more disapproving. She'd been making quiet comments to other adults about children's behavior and party management that had seemed designed to position herself as an experienced voice of wisdom while subtly criticizing the choices David and I had made. The turning point had come during the cake ceremony. Emma had been so excited about her Princess Castle cake that she'd been bouncing slightly as we lit the candles and began singing Happy Birthday. It was the kind of joyful, uninhibited celebration of childhood that any parent dreams of capturing, and David had been recording everything with his phone and beaming with pride at our daughter's happiness. But as Emma had leaned forward to blow out her candles, her movement had been a little too enthusiastic. A small section of pink frosting had gotten on the front of her dress, creating a minor stain that was barely visible, but had apparently been exactly the kind of mess that Elena had been anticipating and dreading. What happened next would change everything between us forever, and set in motion consequences that none of us could have predicted when the day had started with such promise and joy. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The slap echoed across our backyard like a gunshot, cutting through the cheerful chaos of 12 three-year-olds celebrating and reducing the entire party to stunned silence. Emma's joyful laughter stopped mid-giggle. The pink frosting on her dress suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the bright red handprint blooming across her small cheek. For a moment that felt like an eternity, my daughter stood frozen next to her Princess Castle cake, her brown eyes wide with shock and confusion, trying to process what had just happened to her. Then she began to cry, not the dramatic wailing of a toddler denied a toy, but the heartbroken sobbing of a child whose safe world had just shattered without warning. "Elena!" I heard myself shout, my voice carrying a fury I didn't know I possessed. Every maternal instinct I had erupted simultaneously as I rushed toward Emma, but David was already there, scooping our daughter into his arms with the protective intensity of someone trained to respond to sudden threats. What the hell was that? David's voice was quiet, but carried the kind of controlled rage that made his subordinates at the Pentagon step carefully around him when serious problems needed solving. He was holding Emma against his chest, one hand protectively cradling her head, while his eyes fixed on Elena with an expression I'd never seen him direct at family. Elena stood beside the refreshment table, her hand still raised slightly from the slap, looking shocked at her own actions, but not apologetic. If anything, she seemed defiant, as if she'd finally done something that needed doing and wasn't going to back down from the decision. "She was making a mess," Elena said, her voice defensive and sharp. "Someone needed to teach her proper behavior. She can't just do whatever she wants without consequences." The 12 other children at the party had gone completely silent, instinctively understanding that something terrible had happened, even if they couldn't fully comprehend what they'd witnessed. Several of the younger ones had moved closer to their own parents, seeking comfort from the sudden tension that had replaced the celebration's joy. The adult guests were staring in various states of shock and discomfort. Sarah Chen, whose daughter Lucy was Emma's best friend from daycare, looked horrified. Mark and Jennifer Walsh, our neighbors who had become close friends over the past 2 years, were exchanging glances that clearly communicated their disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. But it was the expression on Captain Lisa Rodriguez's face that made my stomach drop even further. Lisa was married to one of David's colleagues at the Pentagon, and she was also a licensed social worker who specialized in child welfare cases for military families.
She was looking at Elena with the kind of professional assessment that meant she was cataloging what she'd observed for potential future reference. "You hit my daughter," I said, my voice shaking as I tried to process the reality of what had just occurred. "You actually hit my 3-year-old daughter at her birthday party." "I gave her a little tap to get her attention," Elena corrected, as if the terminology mattered more than the action. "Children need to learn that actions have consequences. You and David are too soft with her. Someone has to teach her respect." David's jaw was clenched in a way that meant he was working very hard to control his response. Emma was still crying against his shoulder, her small hands clutching his uniform shirt as if he could protect her from whatever had just disrupted her perfect day. "Emma, sweetheart," I said softly, reaching out to stroke her hair. "Daddy and I are here. You're safe now." But even as I tried to comfort my daughter, I was struggling to believe my own words. Emma wasn't safe. Not when Elena was living in our house, not when she believed that physical punishment was an appropriate response to normal childhood behavior, and not when she felt entitled to override our parenting decisions with violence. The other parents were beginning to gather their children, clearly recognizing that the party was effectively over. I could see the concern in their faces as they processed what they'd witnessed, and I knew that this incident would become a story they'd share with their spouses later that evening. Several of them made eye contact with me, offering silent support while herding their own children toward the gate. "I think we should probably head home," Sarah said gently, approaching with Lucy in tow. "Emma, sweetheart, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your birthday. Your party was absolutely beautiful." Lucy, who was mature for her age, seemed to understand that something serious had happened to her best friend. She walked over to where David was holding Emma and offered her own stuffed animal, a small gesture of comfort that nearly broke my heart with its innocent sweetness. "For Emma, to make her feel better," Lucy whispered. Emma accepted the stuffed animal and managed a small smile through her tears, but I could see that the joy had been completely drained from her birthday celebration. What should have been one of her happiest childhood memories had been transformed into something traumatic and confusing. As the other families began to leave, each offering brief but heartfelt apologies for the early departure, I found myself standing in our beautiful backyard, feeling completely lost. The decorations that had taken hours to arrange now seemed like props from someone else's life, a celebration that belonged to people who didn't have to navigate this kind of family crisis. Elena had moved to the patio furniture and sat down heavily, her arms crossed and her expression still defiant. She wasn't apologizing or showing any recognition that her behavior had been inappropriate. If anything, she seemed frustrated that her discipline had disrupted the party rather than corrected Emma's behavior in the way she had intended. David was still holding Emma, swaying slightly in the unconscious motion that had soothed her since she was an infant, but his eyes were fixed on Elena with an intensity that made me nervous about what might happen next. I'd seen David angry before, but this was different. This was the focused fury of someone whose family had been threatened, combined with the strategic thinking of someone who had spent years learning how to neutralize threats effectively. "David," I said quietly, trying to get his attention without alarming Emma further, "maybe we should go inside." He nodded slowly, but didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Elena and spoke in the calm, measured tone he used when delivering information that carried serious consequences. "You will not touch my daughter again," he said. "Not to discipline her, not to correct her behavior, not for any reason. And you will not undermine Rebecca's parenting decisions in our home or anywhere else. This is not a negotiation." Elena's defiance flickered for the first time since the incident. Something in David's voice, or perhaps in his military bearing, had finally penetrated her conviction that she'd been justified in her actions. But instead of backing down or apologizing, she doubled down on her position. "You can't tell me how to interact with my granddaughter," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I have rights too. I've been taking care of children longer than either of you have been alive, and I know what Emma needs even if you don't want to hear it." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see David processing not just Elena's words, but the implications of her attitude. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment that she regretted. This was a fundamental disagreement about boundaries and authority that wasn't going to be resolved through family discussion. Captain Rodriguez approached us, carefully, her professional demeanor evident in how she assessed the situation before speaking. "Rebecca, David, I'm going to head out with the kids, but I wanted you to know that if you need any resources or support in dealing with this situation, please don't hesitate to reach out. What happened here today," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "what happened here today was not appropriate child discipline. It was assault on a minor." Her use of legal terminology wasn't accidental. She was making sure we understood the serious nature of what had occurred while offering her professional expertise in case we needed guidance about next steps. It was exactly the kind of support that military families provided for each other during crises, but it also highlighted how serious this incident had become. After the last guests had left, we found ourselves alone in our backyard with Elena, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a perfect celebration. Emma had finally stopped crying but was clinging to David with the kind of desperate attachment that suggested she didn't feel safe being put down. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of the bounce house motor humming in the background. I looked at the Princess Castle cake, still sitting on the table with 3 candles extinguished, and felt a wave of grief for the childhood memory that had been stolen from my daughter. But more than grief, I felt something else building inside me, a clarity that I'd been avoiding for months as Elena's behavior had escalated. This had been an isolated incident of poor judgment. This had been the inevitable result of a pattern of boundary violations that I'd been too conflict-averse to address directly. Elena had been testing limits and pushing boundaries since she'd moved in with us, and I'd been making excuses for her behavior because I'd wanted to believe that family relationships could be repaired through patience and understanding. But some behaviors couldn't be excused or overlooked, especially when they involved the safety and well-being of my child. Looking at David's expression as he held Emma, I realized that he'd come to the same conclusion. This wasn't a family problem that required delicate navigation and diplomatic solutions. This was a threat to our daughter that required immediate and decisive action. Elena seemed to recognize that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. The defiance in her posture gave way to uncertainty as she looked between David and me, perhaps finally understanding that her actions had consequences that extended beyond a disrupted party. "I think we need to go inside and have a very serious conversation," David said, his voice still controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of finality that suggested decisions were about to be made that couldn't be undone. As we walked toward the house, Emma still in David's arms and Elena trailing behind us, I understood that our family was about to change in ways that none of us could have anticipated when the day had started with such promise. The birthday party was over, but the real confrontation was just beginning. The conversation that followed in our living room would later be referenced in official Pentagon documentation as the catalyst for Operation Family Shield, though none of us knew that at the time. David had settled Emma on the couch with her favorite blanket and the stuffed animal Lucy had given her, then turned to face Elena with the same methodical intensity he brought to briefing senators about national security threats. I sat beside Emma, one hand gently stroking her hair while my mind raced through the implications of what had just happened in our backyard. Elena had positioned herself in the armchair across from us, her posture rigid and defensive. She'd clearly expected this conversation, but her expression suggested she believed she could defend her actions and convince us that physical discipline was not only appropriate, but necessary for Emma's development. She was about to discover how wrong she was.
"Let's start with the facts," David said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used when documenting incidents for official reports. "At approximately 2:15 p.m. today, in front of 12 witness families, you struck our 3-year-old daughter across the face with sufficient force to leave a visible mark. Is that accurate?" Elena's eyes flashed with irritation at his clinical approach. "I didn't strike her, David. I gave her a corrective tap because she was misbehaving and making a mess. There's a difference." Explain the difference, David replied without missing a beat. Because from where I'm standing, an adult using physical force against a toddler for engaging in normal childhood behavior looks exactly like what we'd call assault in any other context. I watched Elena's face change as David's military training became evident in how he controlled the conversation. She'd expected an emotional family argument that she could navigate through guilt and manipulation. Instead, she was facing someone who specialized in extracting information and making strategic decisions under pressure. Emma is my granddaughter, Elena said, her voice rising slightly. I have every right to correct her behavior when her parents aren't doing their job properly. That child has been allowed to run wild since the day she was born, and someone needs to teach her respect for authority. The statement hit me like a physical blow. Elena wasn't just defending her actions, she was attacking our entire approach to parenting while positioning herself as the authority figure who should be making decisions about Emma's care and discipline. Our job? I found my voice, surprised by how steady it sounded despite the fury building inside me. Elena, we are Emma's parents. You are a guest in our home. There is no scenario where you have the right to hit our child for any reason, ever. Elena turned to me with the patronizing expression she'd been using whenever she disagreed with my parenting choices. Rebecca, honey, you mean well, but you don't have experience raising children in the real world. You're too young to understand that children need firm boundaries, not constant coddling. Emma needs discipline now, or she'll grow up thinking she can do whatever she wants without consequences.
David's expression grew even more controlled, which I'd learned over the years was usually a sign that he was reaching the limits of his patience. Elena, Emma is 3 years old. She was celebrating her birthday and got excited about her cake. The consequence you think she deserved was physical violence for acting like a normal toddler. It wasn't violence. It was discipline, something this family clearly doesn't understand. And frankly, I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by people who have no idea how to raise a well-behaved child. The room went silent, except for the sound of Emma's quiet breathing as she dozed against my side, exhausted from the emotional trauma of her ruined birthday party. I looked down at the fading red mark on her cheek and felt something crystallize inside me that had been building for months. This wasn't about different parenting philosophies or generational approaches to child rearing. This was about someone who believed she had the right to override our decisions about our own child, using physical force if necessary to impose her will on our family. Elena, I said quietly, I need you to understand something very clearly. What happened today wasn't discipline. It was an adult losing control and taking out her frustration on a small child, and it will never happen again. Elena's defensive posture shifted to outright aggression. You can't tell me how to interact with Emma. I'm her grandmother, and I've been taking care of children since before you were born. I know what she needs, even if you don't want to hear it. David stood up slowly, and I recognized the movement as his preparation for delivering information that would fundamentally change a situation. In military contexts, this was the moment when he shifted from gathering intelligence to implementing solutions. Elena, here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack your belongings tonight, and you're going to leave our home tomorrow morning. This arrangement isn't working, and after today's incident, it's no longer safe for Emma to be around you unsupervised. Elena's mouth opened in shock, then quickly closed as anger replaced surprise. You can't kick me out. I have nowhere else to go. This is family, David. You don't just abandon family because of one little disagreement. This isn't a disagreement, I said, standing up to join David while carefully avoiding disturbing Emma's rest. This is you assaulting our daughter and then defending your actions as appropriate parenting. There's no middle ground here, Elena. There's no compromise that makes this okay. Elena's face flushed red as she realized we were serious about the consequences she was facing. You're overreacting to a simple correction. Every child needs discipline sometimes. Emma was making a mess and showing off, and she needed to be reminded about proper behavior.
David pulled out his phone and began typing notes, a habit from years of documenting important conversations for later reference. Elena, I want to make sure I understand your position completely. You believe that striking a 3-year-old across the face is appropriate discipline for getting frosting on her dress during her birthday party. I believe that children need to learn respect for adults and consequences for their actions. Emma has been allowed to act like a wild animal since she learned to walk, and it's affecting her behavior around other people. Someone needs to teach her proper conduct. I felt David's tension increase beside me, and I understood that Elena had just provided exactly the kind of clear statement he'd been seeking. In his work, getting people to articulate their positions clearly was often the first step in building a case for action.
So your position is that physical force against toddlers is not only acceptable but necessary for proper child development, David asked, still typing notes on his phone. My position is that children need structure and consequences, and Emma isn't getting either of those things from her parents, Elena said defiantly. I did what needed to be done, and I'd do it again if she continued to misbehave. The statement hung in the air between us like a confession. Elena had just admitted that she viewed physical punishment as an ongoing strategy for managing Emma's behavior, not a momentary lapse in judgment that she regretted. David stopped typing and looked directly at Elena with an expression that I'd seen him use when dealing with security threats that required immediate neutralization. Elena, you just told me that you would hit my daughter again if you believed she was misbehaving. Is that correct? Elena seemed to realize that she'd said something significant, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. I said I would provide appropriate discipline if it was needed. That's what responsible adults do when children are acting out. David nodded slowly, then saved whatever he'd been typing on his phone. Elena, I want you to understand that what you just described meets the legal definition of threatened harm to a minor. You've admitted to assaulting Emma today, and you've stated your intention to do so again in the future if you determine it's necessary. Elena's confidence wavered for the first time since the incident began. That's not what I said. You're twisting my words. I'm documenting exactly what you said, David replied calmly, and tomorrow morning, when you leave our home, I'm going to be filing a report with Child Protective Services detailing today's incident and your stated intentions regarding future physical discipline of Emma. The threat of official involvement finally broke through Elena's defiance. Her face went pale as she realized that David wasn't just talking about family consequences. He was talking about legal and governmental intervention in a situation she'd assumed would remain private. You wouldn't call CPS on family, she said, her voice uncertain for the first time since the confrontation began. I would call CPS on anyone who threatened my daughter's safety, David replied without hesitation. Family relationships don't exempt people from the legal consequences of child abuse. Elena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Child abuse? David, that's insane. I gave her one little slap to get her attention. That's not abuse, that's parenting. Elena, I said quietly, hitting a 3-year-old hard enough to give a mark isn't parenting. It's violence, and threatening to do it again isn't discipline, it's intimidation. Elena looked between David and me as if she was seeing us clearly for the first time. The people she'd been living with for 8 months, the family she'd assumed would tolerate her behavior indefinitely, had become something else entirely. We were no longer her accommodating daughter-in-law and son-in-law who could be guilt-tripped into accepting her judgment about child-rearing. We were parents protecting our child from someone who had demonstrated both the willingness and the intention to harm her. I need to make some phone calls, David said, glancing at his watch. Elena, I suggest you start packing tonight. Captain Rodriguez will be by tomorrow morning to escort you to temporary housing that's been arranged through Military Family Services. Elena's eyes widened as she realized the implications of David's connections and authority. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It had become an official matter involving military protocols and government resources. What kind of temporary housing? She asked, her voice small. David's expression remained neutral. The kind that is available to family members who require supervised accommodation while their situations are being evaluated by appropriate authorities. Elena sank back into her chair as the full scope of what was happening finally registered. She'd assumed that family loyalty and emotional manipulation would protect her from serious consequences. Instead, she was facing immediate displacement and official scrutiny of her behavior. But as I watched her process the reality of her situation, I realized that David's response was just the beginning.
The phone calls he was about to make would set in motion a series of events that would extend far beyond Elena's immediate housing situation. When a Pentagon chief of staff documents threats against his family and requests official intervention, the response tends to be both swift and comprehensive. Elena had chosen the wrong family to test the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and she was about to discover exactly how seriously the United States military takes the protection of its personnel and their dependents. While Elena retreated to the guest room to begin packing, David disappeared into his home office to make what he called necessary notifications. I remained in the living room with Emma, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep against my shoulder, her small body still occasionally shuddering with the aftershocks of tears. I could hear David's voice through the closed office door, low, controlled, and using the kind of precise military language that meant he was speaking with people who understood the gravity of official protocols. The calls went on for over an hour, each conversation building on the previous one as David worked through what I was beginning to understand was a complex chain of command notification process. When he finally emerged from the office, his expression was grim but focused. "Rebecca, we need to talk about what happens next," he said quietly, glancing toward Emma to ensure she was still sleeping. I carefully moved Emma to her favorite spot on the couch, covering her with the soft blanket she'd had since infancy, then joined David in the kitchen where we could speak without disturbing her rest.
"The first call was to my immediate supervisor, Colonel Patricia Williams," David began, his voice maintaining the professional tone that told me he was processing this situation through his military training rather than just his emotions as an angry father. Under Pentagon protocol, any incident involving potential harm to military dependents must be reported within 24 hours. What happened today qualifies as a mandatory reporting situation. I felt a chill as I realized that Elena's actions had triggered institutional responses that extended far beyond our family. What does that mean exactly? David pulled out a small notebook, the kind he used for official business, and flipped to the pages where he'd been documenting our conversation with Elena. "It means that as of 6:30 p.m. today, there's an official case file being opened. The incident will be investigated by military family advocacy personnel, Child Protective Services will be notified, and Elena's background will be thoroughly reviewed." The scope of what he was describing felt overwhelming. "David, are you sure this is necessary? I mean, I want Elena out of our house immediately, but do we really need to involve all these official agencies?" David set down his notebook and looked at me with the kind of serious expression that meant he was about to share information I might not want to hear. "Rebecca, this stopped being about our family the moment Elena admitted she would hit Emma again. When someone threatens harm to a military dependent, the response is systematic and thorough. But there's something else." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Colonel Williams asked me to review Elena's behavior patterns since she's been living here. When I described the incidents you've told me about over the past few months, the undermining, the criticism, the boundary violations, she recommended a comprehensive background investigation." A background investigation on my mother? The concept seemed surreal, like something from a spy novel rather than a family crisis. "Elena has been living in the home of a Pentagon chief of staff for 8 months. She's had access to classified materials, official communications, and sensitive information about military operations. Any behavior that suggests instability or poor judgment triggers automatic security review protocols." I sank into one of the kitchen chairs as the implications began to register. Elena's actions hadn't just affected our family, they'd potentially compromised David's security clearance and his ability to do his job effectively. The second call was to Captain Rodriguez. As a licensed social worker with security clearance, she's been assigned as the military family advocate for this case. She'll be conducting formal interviews with everyone who witnessed today's incident. I thought about the other parents who had been at Emma's party, the children who had seen Elena slap my daughter, and felt a wave of embarrassment about how public this situation had become. What kind of interviews? Standard protocol for documenting child welfare incidents. Captain Rodriguez will need statements from each adult witness, and she'll need to conduct age-appropriate interviews with the children to understand what they observed and how it affected them. The idea of Emma having to relive the trauma of her birthday party through official questioning made my stomach clench.
Does Emma have to be interviewed too? David's expression softened slightly. Yes, but Captain Rodriguez specializes in working with military children. She knows how to conduct these interviews in ways that minimize additional trauma. Emma will have advocates present, and the questioning will be designed to be supportive rather than invasive. A sound from the guest room interrupted our conversation. Elena moving around, apparently following through on the packing instructions David had given her. The reality of her leaving felt both relieving and surreal. This morning, she'd been a permanent part of our household. Tonight, she was becoming a security risk who required official monitoring. The third call was to Pentagon security, David said, lowering his voice further. Elena's access to our home and any materials related to my work is being officially terminated. There will be a security sweep tomorrow to ensure no sensitive information has been compromised. I stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what Elena's behavior had triggered. David, this is escalating so fast. Are you sure we can't handle this more quietly? David reached across the table and took my hand, his expression shifting from professional to personal. Rebecca, I know this feels overwhelming, but think about what Elena said in there. She admitted she would hit Emma again. She showed no remorse for what she did, and she positioned herself as the authority figure who gets to decide how our daughter should be disciplined. He was right, and I knew it. Elena hadn't just made a mistake. She'd revealed a fundamental belief system that made her a continuing threat to Emma's safety and well-being. But there's more. David continued. The fourth call was to a friend of mine who works in military intelligence background investigations. I asked him to run an informal review of Elena's history just to see if there were any red flags we should be aware of. What kind of red flags? David consulted his notebook again. Criminal history, financial issues, mental health episodes, previous CPS reports, anything that might explain her behavior patterns or predict future risk factors. The preliminary results came back while I was still on the phone. David said, carefully, Rebecca, Elena has a history that we didn't know about. My blood went cold. What kind of history?
David flipped to a fresh page in his notebook, where he'd apparently been taking notes during his phone conversations. In 1995, when she was living in Phoenix, there was a CPS investigation involving your cousin Maria's children. Elena was providing childcare while Maria worked, and there were reports of inappropriate physical discipline. I felt the world shift slightly around me. Maria was Elena's niece, and I remembered visiting her family when I was a teenager. I'd always wondered why those visits had stopped abruptly, but Elena had explained it as a family disagreement that would eventually resolve itself. The case was closed without formal charges because Maria removed the children from Elena's care and moved to a different state, David continued. But the investigating social worker noted concerns about Elena's anger management and her beliefs about appropriate child discipline. 28 years ago? I said weakly. Why didn't this come up before? Because Elena was never charged with anything, and the records are sealed unless there's an official reason to review them, David explained. But once a new incident is reported, previous investigations become relevant to determining ongoing risk factors. I thought about the months Elena had been caring for Emma while I worked, the times I'd come home to find Emma unusually quiet or subdued, the occasions when Elena had made comments about Emma needing more discipline that I'd dismissed as generational differences. There's more, David said gently. In 2003, Elena was asked to leave a volunteer position at a church daycare in Baltimore after parents complained about her interactions with children. And in 2008, she had a restraining order filed against her by a neighbor who claimed Elena had been harassing their family about their parenting choices. Each revelation felt like a piece of a puzzle I'd never realized I was supposed to be solving. Elena's behavior toward Emma hadn't been isolated incidents or generational misunderstandings. They'd been part of a consistent pattern spanning decades. David, how long have you known about this? I found out tonight, he replied. But I've been concerned about Elena's behavior for months. I just didn't have enough information to understand what we were dealing with.
I felt a crushing wave of guilt as I realized how many warning signs I'd missed or rationalized away. Elena's criticism of my parenting, her inappropriate comments about Emma's behavior, her constant attempts to undermine the boundaries David and I had established, all of it should have been recognized as red flags, rather than family dynamics to be managed. "Rebecca, this isn't your fault," David said, apparently reading my expression. "Elena is skilled at presenting herself as a concerned grandmother, rather than someone with a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward children. Even trained professionals didn't catch it initially." A sound from the living room indicated that Emma was stirring from her nap. I went to check on her and found her sitting up on the couch, looking disoriented and calling for me with the kind of anxiety that suggested she was remembering what had happened earlier. "Mommy, where is Grandma Elena?" Emma asked as I sat beside her and pulled her onto my lap. "Grandma Elena is going to be staying somewhere else from now on," I said carefully, trying to find words that would be honest but not frightening for a 3-year-old to process. "Because she hurt me?" Emma's voice was small and confused. "Because what she did wasn't okay, and we want to make sure you're always safe," I replied, holding her close and feeling grateful that children her age were resilient enough to process difficult situations without understanding all the complicated adult implications. David appeared in the doorway, and Emma immediately reached for him, clearly needing the security of both parents after the trauma she had experienced. As he lifted her up, I could see the determination in his expression that meant he was preparing for whatever came next in this process. "The final call I made tonight was to General Morrison," David said quietly, while Emma settled against his shoulder. "I requested emergency leave to handle this family situation and ensure Emma's safety during the investigation process." General Morrison was David's ultimate supervisor, a 3-star general who controlled Pentagon operations that I wasn't cleared to know about. The fact that David had involved someone at that level meant this situation had moved beyond family conflict into matters of national security and military readiness. What did he say? David's expression was grim, but satisfied. He said that protecting military families is a Pentagon priority, and that anyone who threatens a service member's dependents should expect the full weight of institutional response. Elena may think she's dealing with family consequences, but she's actually triggered protocols designed to neutralize threats to military personnel. As I held Emma and listened to David describe the machinery of official response that was now focused on protecting our family, I realized that Elena had made a catastrophic miscalculation when she'd chosen to assert her authority through violence. She'd assumed that family loyalty would shield her from serious consequences, but she'd actually created a situation where some of the most powerful institutions in the country would be evaluating her behavior and determining appropriate responses. Tomorrow morning, Elena would discover just how seriously the United States military takes threats to its people. I woke up at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of unfamiliar vehicles in our driveway. Through the bedroom window, I could see a black SUV with government plates and a white van marked Military Family Services parked behind David's car. The official response David had initiated was beginning in earnest. Emma was still sleeping between David and I. We had made the decision to keep her close overnight after the trauma of yesterday's events. She'd had nightmares twice during the night, waking up crying and asking if Grandma Elena was going to hurt me again. Each time, David and I had taken turns reassuring her and exchanging looks that confirmed we made the right decision about involving official authorities.
David was already awake, checking his phone for what I assumed were updates about the investigation process. His expression was focused but calm, the demeanor of someone who is confident that the right systems were now in motion to address a serious problem. "They're early," he said quietly, nodding toward the window. "Captain Rodriguez texted that they'd be here at 06:30 for Elena's transition to temporary housing." I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety about Elena's departure. For 8 months, she'd been a constant presence in our home, and despite all the conflict and boundary violations, her absence would represent a fundamental change in our family dynamic. "Is she awake?" I asked, listening for sounds from the guest room. "She's been moving around since 5:30, David replied. I think she understands that this isn't a negotiation or a temporary cooling off period. The official involvement has made it clear that there are real consequences for what she did. A soft knock on our front door interrupted the conversation. David moved carefully to avoid disturbing Emma, then headed downstairs to meet with whatever military personnel had arrived to handle Elena's relocation. I could hear voices in the entryway, David's familiar tone mixed with crisp, professional exchanges that meant military protocols were being followed. After a few minutes, I heard Elena's door open, and her voice, higher and more defensive than usual, as she apparently tried to negotiate or delay the process somehow. Emma stirred beside me, her eyes opening with the cautious awareness that had replaced her usual morning enthusiasm since yesterday's incident. "Mommy, are the people here to take Grandma Elena away?" "The people are here to help Grandma Elena find a place to stay where she can get help," I said carefully, trying to provide an explanation that was honest but not frightening for a 3-year-old to process. Emma considered this for a moment, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Was I bad yesterday? Is that why Grandma Elena got angry?" My heart broke as I realized that Emma was trying to make sense of being hit by interpreting it as her own fault, exactly the kind of psychological damage that made Elena's behavior so dangerous and unacceptable. "Emma, sweetheart, you were not bad yesterday," I said firmly, pulling her close. "You were celebrating your birthday and having fun, exactly like you were supposed to do. What Grandma Elena did was wrong, and it had nothing to do with you being good or bad." "But she said I was making a mess," Emma said quietly. "Emma, getting frosting on your dress at your birthday party isn't being bad. It's being a happy 3-year-old. Grandma Elena made a mistake when she got angry about that, and now she needs to learn better ways to handle her feelings." The conversation downstairs was becoming more heated. I could hear Elena's voice rising as she apparently realized that the military personnel weren't there to mediate or negotiate. They were there to implement decisions that had already been made through official channels. "This is ridiculous," Elena's voice carried up the stairs. "I don't need supervised housing. I need to stay here with my family. Rebecca and David are overreacting to a simple misunderstanding." Captain Rodriguez's voice was professional but firm in response. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the incident yesterday has been classified as assault on a minor with threat of repeated violence. The housing arrangement is not optional, and it includes mandatory counseling and evaluation services." I heard Elena's sharp intake of breath as the full reality of her situation became clear. She wasn't just being asked to leave our home. She was being placed in a supervised living situation where her behavior would be monitored and evaluated by mental health professionals. "I want to speak with Rebecca," Elena demanded. "She's my daughter-in-law. She understands that I was just trying to help Emma learn proper behavior." "Mrs. Martinez has provided a written statement supporting the military family advocate's recommendations," came David's voice, steady and final. "The decision has been made through appropriate channels." The sound of Elena's suitcases being moved suggested that the relocation was proceeding despite her objections. I was grateful that David and the military personnel were handling the logistics, because I wasn't sure I could have managed a direct confrontation with Elena while Emma was listening to every word. 20 minutes later, David returned to the bedroom with a cup of coffee and an expression that suggested the most difficult part of the morning was over. "Elena's been relocated to a supervised housing facility in Bethesda. She'll remain there while the investigation is completed and her evaluation is conducted. The facility specializes in situations where family members require assessment and intervention services." "How did she react to leaving?" I asked. David's expression was grim. "She threatened to contact a lawyer and sue for grandparents' rights. She also said she was going to call your other relatives to tell them we're keeping Emma away from family for no reason." The idea of Elena involving extended family or legal representation felt daunting, but I realized that David's systematic approach to documenting everything had probably anticipated these possibilities.
Captain Rodriguez said that Elena's threats to pursue legal action actually support the assessment that she doesn't understand the seriousness of what she did. Someone who recognizes that hitting a child was wrong would be focused on apologizing and getting help, not on finding ways to maintain access to the child. Emma had been listening to our conversation with the intense focus that 3-year-olds bring to adult discussions they sense are important. "Daddy, is Grandma Elena going to come back to our house?"
David sat on the edge of the bed and looked directly at Emma with the kind of serious expression he used when he needed her to understand something important. "Emma, Grandma Elena won't be living in our house anymore. If she wants to see you again someday, she'll need to learn better ways to treat children, and there will always be other adults present to make sure you're safe." "Like a timeout for grown-ups?" Emma asked, apparently trying to relate Elena's situation to discipline concepts she understood. "Something like that," David agreed. "When grown-ups make bad choices that hurt children, they have to go to special places where other grown-ups can help them learn better ways to behave." The explanation seemed to satisfy Emma's need to understand what was happening without providing more detail than she could process at her age. But I could see in her expression that she was still working through the emotional impact of yesterday's trauma. After breakfast, Captain Rodriguez returned for what she called the family interview process. She was a woman in her early 40s with a warm but professional demeanor that immediately put Emma at ease. I could see why David had confidence in her ability to handle the investigation sensitively. "Emma, I heard you had a very special birthday party yesterday," Captain Rodriguez began, settling into the living room with a tablet and a small bag of age-appropriate toys. "Can you tell me about your favorite part?" Emma's face lit up as she described the bounce house, the face painting, and the princess castle cake. For a few minutes, she was able to relive the joy of the celebration before the incident that had ruined everything. "That sounds like an amazing party," Captain Rodriguez said. "I bet you felt very happy and excited." "I was very happy until Grandma Elena got angry at me." Captain Rodriguez nodded seriously. "Can you tell me what happened when Grandma Elena got angry?" Emma's expression grew uncertain, and she moved closer to me on the couch. "She hit me because I got cake on my dress, but it was an accident. I was just excited about blowing out my candles." "Emma, what you're describing sounds very scary," Captain Rodriguez said gently. "When adults hit children, it can make children feel confused and sad, even when the children didn't do anything wrong. I asked Mommy if I was bad, but Mommy said I wasn't bad. She said Grandma Elena made a mistake." Captain Rodriguez looked at me with an expression of approval for how I'd handled Emma's confusion about blame and responsibility. "Your mommy is absolutely right, Emma. You weren't bad, and what happened wasn't your fault." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Captain Rodriguez asking carefully crafted questions that allowed Emma to describe her experience without being traumatized by having to relive it in detail. Throughout the process, Emma remained calm and articulate, apparently feeling safe enough to share her perspective honestly. After breakfast, Emma went to her room to play. Captain Rodriguez turned her attention to me. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask you some questions about Elena's behavior patterns during the time she's been living in your home." Over the next hour, I found myself describing months of incidents that I had previously minimized or rationalized away. Elena's criticism of Emma's normal childhood behavior, her attempts to undermine my parenting decisions, her inappropriate comments about Emma needing more discipline, her boundary violations around family rules and expectations. "Mrs. Martinez, you've described a pattern of escalating behavior that's consistent with what we call authority displacement. Elena appears to have been testing boundaries and asserting control over Emma's care in increasingly inappropriate ways. I kept thinking it was just adjustment issues. I wanted to believe that patience and understanding would help her find her place in our family without creating conflict." Captain Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. Many families struggle with these dynamics, especially when there are generational differences about child-rearing approaches.
but Elena's behavior yesterday crossed a clear line from inappropriate boundary violations to physical violence. She consulted her tablet, apparently reviewing notes from multiple interviews. The witnesses from yesterday's party have provided consistent accounts of what they observed. Several of them mentioned that Elena's behavior throughout the party seemed focused on criticism and control rather than celebration and support. I thought about Sarah Chen's expression when Elena had hit Emma, the way the other parents had immediately understood that something terrible had happened, and felt grateful that there had been so many credible witnesses to support our account of the incident. "What happens next?" I asked. Captain Rodriguez's expression became more formal. "Elena will undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation at the Bethesda facility. The evaluation will assess her understanding of appropriate child discipline, her anger management capabilities, and her willingness to accept responsibility for her actions." She paused, apparently choosing her words carefully. "Based on the preliminary assessment and Elena's response to being relocated, I'm recommending that any future contact with Emma be strictly supervised and conditional on Elena completing mandatory counseling and anger management programs." The recommendation felt both appropriate and sad. I'd hope that Elena's relationship with Emma could be repaired through honest conversation and mutual understanding, but her defiance yesterday and her threats this morning had made it clear that she wasn't ready to acknowledge the seriousness of her actions. The investigation will be completed within 2 weeks. At that point, formal recommendations will be made about ongoing safety measures and any legal actions that may be appropriate. As Captain Rodriguez prepared to leave, she handed me a folder containing resources for military families dealing with child welfare issues. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that what happened yesterday wasn't a reflection of your parenting or your family's stability. Elena's behavior was the result of her own issues, and you responded appropriately by prioritizing Emma's safety."
After she left, I sat in our quiet living room and reflected on how much our lives had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, we'd been preparing for Emma's birthday party with excitement and anticipation. Today, we were dealing with official investigations, supervised housing arrangements, and psychological evaluations. But as I watched Emma playing happily in her room, apparently resilient enough to begin processing yesterday's trauma in healthy ways, I felt grateful that David's position and resources had allowed us to respond so comprehensively to Elena's threat. Emma was safe. Elena was receiving appropriate intervention, and our family was being supported by institutions designed to protect military dependents from exactly these kinds of situations. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. David answered from his office, and I could hear him speaking in the clipped, professional tone that meant he was receiving official updates about the investigation. When he emerged from the office, his expression was serious, but satisfied. "That was Colonel Williams," he said. "The Pentagon security review is complete, and Elena's background investigation has revealed additional information that changes the scope of this case significantly." I felt my stomach clench as I realized that we were about to learn something that would make Elena's behavior even more concerning than we'd already discovered. "What kind of additional information?" I asked. David sat beside me on the couch, his expression indicating that he was about to share news that would fundamentally change how we understood the situation we'd been dealing with. "Elena hasn't just been a problem for our family, Rebecca. She's been a problem for military families before." The revelation that Elena had a history with military families hit me like a physical blow. I sank deeper into the cushions as David pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd been using to document our family crisis, but now it contained information that extended far beyond our personal situation. Colonel Williams' investigation team found 3 separate incidents involving military families over the past 15 years, David said, his voice carrying the controlled tension that meant he was sharing information that had serious implications. "Elena has been systematically targeting military spouses and their children, using her relationship with service members to gain access to families during vulnerable periods." My mind raced as I tried to process what David was telling me. Targeting? David, what do you mean by targeting? David consulted his notes, clearly working through information that was both sensitive and disturbing. In 2008, Elena moved in with her nephew Marcus Rodriguez and his wife Jennifer when Marcus was deployed to Iraq. Jennifer was alone with 2 young children, ages 2 and 4, and needed help managing the household. He paused, flipping to another page. Within 3 months, Jennifer had filed a restraining order against Elena after multiple incidents of inappropriate physical discipline and emotional abuse of the children. Elena was removed from the home by military police, and Marcus had to request emergency leave to deal with the family crisis. I felt sick as I realized the similarities between Jennifer's situation and my own. What happened to that family? Marcus and Jennifer divorced 2 years later, David replied grimly. According to the investigation notes, the stress of Elena's behavior and the family conflict it created contributed to the breakdown of their marriage. Jennifer moved back to her home state with the children, and Marcus left the military. The idea that Elena's interference had destroyed a military family felt like a preview of what could have happened to us if David hadn't acted so decisively. Were there other incidents? David nodded, turning to another section of his notes. In 2014, Elena moved in with Staff Sergeant Maria Santos and her husband when Maria was dealing with postpartum depression after her 3rd child. Elena positioned herself as a helpful grandmother figure who could provide childcare and household support. Let me guess, I said, feeling a horrible pattern emerging. It didn't go well. Within 6 months, Maria had attempted suicide, David said quietly. She left a note saying she felt like a failure as a mother and couldn't handle Elena's constant criticism and interference with her children. Elena had convinced Maria that her parenting was inadequate and that the children would be better off in Elena's care. The scope of Elena's destructive behavior was becoming clear, and I felt a crushing sense of guilt about how close our family had come to experiencing similar devastation. David, what happened to Maria? She survived the suicide attempt and received treatment for severe depression, but the family was permanently damaged. Elena had systematically undermined Maria's confidence as a mother while positioning herself as the competent caregiver who understood what the children really needed. I thought about the months of Elena's criticism and boundary violations, the way she'd consistently suggested that my parenting was too lenient and that Emma needed more discipline. The pattern was identical to what David was describing, but I'd been too close to the situation to recognize it as deliberate psychological manipulation. There's more, David continued. In 2019, Elena moved in with Colonel Patricia Hayes and her family when Patricia's husband was killed in Afghanistan. Patricia was a single mother dealing with grief while trying to maintain her military career and care for her 8-year-old son. David's expression grew even more serious. Elena managed to convince Patricia that she was incapable of raising her son properly while maintaining her military duties. She pressured Patricia to leave the military and move closer to Elena's extended family, where Elena could take a more active role in raising the child. David flipped to another page of notes. The commanding officer ordered a family wellness check that revealed Elena had been isolating Patricia from her support network, criticizing her parenting decisions, and systematically destroying her confidence in her ability to balance motherhood and military service. The methodical nature of Elena's behavior was becoming terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a grandmother with poor boundaries. This was someone who had developed a systematic approach to infiltrating military families and causing maximum psychological damage. Elena was removed from Patricia's home and banned from all military installations, David continued. Patricia received counseling and was able to continue her military career, but the psychological damage took years to repair. I felt overwhelmed by the scope of Elena's destructive history. David, how did we not know about any of this? How did Elena keep getting access to military families? David's expression was grim. Elena was careful never to face formal charges. She would create family crises and psychological damage, then move on before official action could be taken. And military families often handle these situations internally to protect service members' careers and security clearances. But why target military families specifically? David was quiet for a moment, apparently considering how to explain something that required understanding of military culture and vulnerabilities.
Military families are uniquely vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, Rebecca. We deal with frequent deployments, high stress, limited support networks, and pressure to maintain family stability despite challenging circumstances. He continued, Elena has figured out how to exploit those vulnerabilities. She presents herself as a helpful family member during crisis periods, then gradually asserts control while undermining the confidence and authority of the actual parents. The realization that our family had been targeted rather than randomly affected felt both vindicating and terrifying. Elena's behavior hadn't been the result of grief or adjustment issues. It had been a calculated strategy based on previous success with similar families. There's something else, David said, his voice carrying a new level of concern. The investigation revealed that Elena has been in contact with other military families in the Washington, D.C. area. She appears to be actively seeking opportunities to involve herself in situations where she can replay this pattern. I felt a chill as I understood the implications. You mean she's looking for her next targets? Colonel Williams' team found evidence that Elena had been corresponding with 3 other military wives who were dealing with deployment separations and family stress. She'd been positioning herself as an experienced military family member who understood the challenges and could provide support and guidance. The idea that Elena was systematically hunting for vulnerable military families felt like something from a psychological thriller rather than our family crisis. David, have those families been warned? As of this morning, yes, David replied. Military family advocacy personnel have contacted each family to alert them about Elena's history and methods. The families have been advised to avoid any contact and to report any attempts at communication immediately. I thought about how Elena had initially seemed like such a blessing when she'd offered to help with Emma's care during David's deployments. Her timing had been perfect. Her offers of help had addressed real needs, and her presentation as a loving grandmother had felt like exactly what our family needed. She knew exactly what to offer us, I said, understanding finally dawning. Elena knew that David was deploying frequently, that I was struggling to balance work and childcare, and that we didn't have family support nearby. David nodded grimly. Elena's approach is sophisticated and targeted. She identifies military families in vulnerable situations, then positions herself as the solution to their problems while gradually taking control of family dynamics. The phone in David's office began ringing, and he excused himself to take another update about the investigation. I remained in the living room, trying to process the enormity of what we discovered about Elena's history and methods. Emma appeared in the doorway, apparently having finished playing in her room and looking for interaction with her parents. Mommy, can we go to the park today? The normalcy of her request felt jarring after the conversation David and I had just had about systematic psychological manipulation and targeted family destruction. But looking at Emma's hopeful expression, I realized that this was exactly what we needed, a return to ordinary family activities that reinforced our stability and security. That sounds like a wonderful idea, sweetheart, I said, pulling her onto my lap. We can go to your favorite park with the big slide. Emma settled against me with the kind of comfortable trust that told me she was beginning to feel secure again after yesterday's trauma. Her resilience was remarkable, but I understood that maintaining her sense of safety would require ongoing vigilance and appropriate boundaries. David returned from his office call with an expression that suggested the investigation was continuing to reveal disturbing information. That was Captain Rodriguez, David said. Elena's psychological evaluation has begun, and the preliminary assessment is concerning. What kind of concerning? David sat down beside us, automatically reaching out to stroke Emma's hair in the unconscious gesture of protection that had become more pronounced since yesterday's incident. Elena shows no recognition that her behavior toward Emma was inappropriate. She's maintaining that she was providing necessary discipline and that our reaction is evidence of permissive parenting that's harmful to Emma's development. The evaluation results weren't surprising given Elena's defiant attitude yesterday, but they confirmed that her behavior represented a genuine ongoing threat rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the evaluating psychologist, says Elena demonstrates what she calls pathological grandparent syndrome. Elena genuinely believes she has superior knowledge about child rearing, and that parents who disagree with her methods are harming their children through inadequate discipline. So she actually thinks she was helping Emma?
Elena believes she was saving Emma from what she considers our ineffective parenting, David replied. Dr. Mitchell says this kind of delusional thinking is extremely difficult to treat because Elena doesn't recognize that her behavior is problematic. Emma had been listening to our conversation with the focused attention that meant she was trying to understand adult issues that affected her directly. "Daddy, does that mean Grandma Elena still thinks I was being bad?" David's expression softened as he looked at Emma directly. "Emma, Grandma Elena is confused about how children should be treated. The doctors are trying to help her understand better ways to show love and care." "But she's not coming back to our house?" Emma asked, apparently needing reassurance about her ongoing safety. "She's not coming back to our house," David confirmed. "And if she ever wants to see you again, there will always be other grown-ups present to make sure you're safe and treated properly." The conversation was interrupted by another phone call, this one on David's military cell phone, with the distinctive ringtone that meant official Pentagon business. David stepped away to take the call, leaving Emma and me to plan our park visit. "Mommy, will the park be fun today?" Emma asked, apparently needing reassurance that normal activities could still be enjoyable after yesterday's trauma. "The park will be very fun," I assured her. "We can swing on the swings, go down the slide, and maybe stop for ice cream on the way home." Emma's face lit up with the kind of uncomplicated joy that reminded me how resilient children could be when they felt safe and supported. Her ability to look forward to simple pleasures despite what she'd experienced gave me hope that the psychological damage from Elena's behavior could be minimized through consistent love and appropriate boundaries. David returned from his phone call with an expression that suggested the scope of Elena's situation was continuing to expand. "That was General Morrison's office," he said. "The Elena Rodriguez case has been classified as a matter of military family security. The investigation is being elevated to include federal agencies." I felt a mixture of satisfaction and amazement that Elena's actions had triggered responses at the highest levels of military and federal authority. What does that mean exactly? David's expression was grim and satisfied. It means Elena's pattern of targeting military families has been recognized as a threat to military readiness and family stability. The response is going to be comprehensive and permanent. As I held Emma and listened to David describe the expanding investigation, I realized that Elena's decision to assert control through violence had been the worst possible miscalculation. She'd assumed that family loyalty and emotional manipulation would protect her from serious consequences, but she'd actually created a situation where the full weight of military and federal authority would be focused on preventing her from harming other families. Elena's war against military families was about to face the kind of institutional response that she had never anticipated or prepared for. 3 days after Elena's removal from our home, I found myself sitting in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, surrounded by officials whose job titles I wasn't entirely sure I understood. The room had no windows, multiple phones with different colored handsets, and the kind of serious atmosphere that made it clear we were no longer dealing with a family matter. "Mrs. Martinez, thank you for making time for this briefing," said Agent Jennifer Walsh from the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. She was a woman in her late 30s with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she specialized in cases involving threats to military personnel. What started as a child welfare incident has evolved into something much more significant. David sat beside me, wearing his dress uniform rather than civilian clothes, a choice that I understood meant this meeting was being treated as official military business rather than family support. Emma was at a playdate with her friend Lucy, carefully arranged so that this conversation could happen without her overhearing details that might be frightening or confusing. The investigation into Elena Rodriguez has revealed a pattern of behavior that extends beyond targeting individual military families, Agent Walsh continued, consulting a thick folder that apparently contained evidence I couldn't have imagined existed 3 days ago.
We believe Elena has been operating what we're classifying as a domestic psychological warfare campaign against military dependence. The terminology felt surreal. Psychological war was something that happened between countries, not something that occurred in suburban Virginia kitchens and birthday parties. But as Agent Walsh began outlining their findings, the military framework started to make disturbing sense. Elena's methodology shows sophisticated understanding of military family vulnerabilities and systematic exploitation of those weaknesses to achieve maximum psychological damage, Agent Walsh explained. Her targets are specifically chosen for their isolation, stress levels, and dependence on family support networks. Dr. Thompson, a military psychologist who specialized in family dynamics and psychological operations, leaned forward to add context. Mrs. Martinez, Elena's approach mirrors techniques used in hostile interrogation and psychological manipulation campaigns. She's not just someone with poor boundaries. She's someone who has developed a systematic method for breaking down family structures. I felt a chill as I realized that our family crisis was being analyzed through the lens of enemy action and psychological warfare. Dr. Thompson, are you saying Elena was deliberately trying to destroy military families? We believe Elena has what we call institutional antisocial personality disorder. She specifically targets military families because she understands their vulnerabilities and has developed effective methods for exploiting them. The pattern shows planning, preparation, and systematic execution over multiple years. Agent Walsh opened another section of her folder that revealed what appeared to be a timeline spanning nearly 20 years. Elena's documented interactions with military families show clear escalation and sophistication and psychological impact. Early cases involved basic boundary violations and inappropriate discipline. Recent cases show advanced manipulation techniques designed to cause maximum family destabilization.
What do you mean by advanced manipulation techniques? David asked, his voice carrying the controlled tension that meant he was processing information that had professional as well as personal implications. Agent Walsh consulted her notes. Elena has learned to identify specific psychological pressure points for different types of military families. For families dealing with deployment separation, she focuses on undermining spousal confidence and creating dependency. For families dealing with trauma or loss, she exploits grief and vulnerability to position herself as an indispensable support figure. Dr. Thompson added, Elena's approach to your family was textbook psychological manipulation, Mrs. Martinez. She identified your concerns about balancing work and motherhood, your husband's frequent deployments, and your lack of nearby family support. Then she systematically exploited each of those vulnerabilities while positioning herself as the solution to your problems. The clinical analysis of how Elena had targeted our family felt both validating and disturbing. Every offer of help, every criticism of my parenting, every boundary violation had been part of a calculated strategy rather than the natural conflicts of multi-generational living. The incident with Emma wasn't a loss of control, Agent Walsh continued. Based on Elena's psychological profile and her history with other families, we believe the physical violence was a deliberate escalation designed to assert complete authority over Emma's care while testing your willingness to protect her from Elena's discipline methods. I thought about Elena's defiant attitude after hitting Emma, her refusal to apologize, and her threats to repeat the behavior if Emma continued to misbehave. The psychological evaluation had been right. Elena genuinely believed she had the right to use physical force to control Emma's behavior. Mrs. Martinez, we need to ask you some specific questions about Elena's behavior during the months she lived in your home. The information you provide will be used to build a comprehensive case profile that may be relevant to prosecuting Elena for federal crimes. Over the next hour, I found myself recounting months of incidents through a completely different lens. Elena's questions about David's work schedule weren't just curiosity. They were intelligence gathering about when I would be most vulnerable and isolated. Her criticism of my parenting wasn't just generational differences, it was systematic undermining of my confidence and authority. Her offers to take care of Emma during my work hours weren't just helpful family support. They were opportunities to establish herself as the primary caregiver while positioning me as an inadequate mother who needed her assistance to function properly. Elena's access to classified materials in your home is a separate concern, Agent Walsh noted. During the 8 months she lived with you, Elena had potential exposure to Colonel Martinez's work communications, official documents, and security protocols. We're treating this as a possible intelligence security breach. David's expression became more serious. Agent Walsh, are you suggesting Elena might have been gathering information about my work? We're investigating that possibility, Agent Walsh replied. Elena's pattern of targeting military families in the Washington, D.C. area, combined with her systematic approach to psychological manipulation, raises questions about whether her activities might have been coordinated or directed by hostile interests. The suggestion that Elena might have been working for foreign intelligence agencies felt like something from a spy novel, but I realized that her sophisticated targeting methods and extensive knowledge of military family vulnerabilities could have been developed through external guidance rather than personal experience alone. However, Dr. Thompson added, Elena's approach to your family was textbook psychological manipulation, Mrs. Martinez. She identified your concerns about balancing work and motherhood, your husband's frequent deployments, and your lack of nearby family support. Then she systematically exploited each of those vulnerabilities while positioning herself as the solution to your problems. Elena's current legal situation is complex. She's facing potential federal charges for systematic harassment of military families, child endangerment, and possible security violations. But she's also being evaluated for psychological competence to stand trial. What does that mean for our family? I asked. Elena will remain in supervised custody indefinitely, Agent Walsh replied. Even if she's determined to be psychologically competent for trial, the charges she's facing carry significant prison sentences, and if she's determined to be mentally incompetent, she'll be committed to a secure psychiatric facility. David leaned forward slightly. Agent Walsh, what about the other families Elena has targeted? Are they receiving protection and support? The Department of Defense has established a task force specifically focused on supporting military families affected by Elena's activities, Agent Walsh replied. We're providing counseling services, security assessments, and ongoing monitoring to ensure no further contact or harassment occurs. Dr. Thompson added, we're also developing training materials to help military family advocacy personnel recognize similar patterns in the future. Elena's case has revealed vulnerabilities in how we protect military dependents from this type of targeted psychological manipulation. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering security protocols for our family, ongoing investigation timelines, and resources available for Emma's continued recovery from the trauma she'd experienced. Throughout the briefing, I felt a strange combination of gratitude and disbelief that Elena's actions had triggered such comprehensive institutional response. When the meeting concluded, David and I were escorted to another secure conference room where General Morrison was waiting to speak with us personally. General Morrison was a 3-star general who controlled Pentagon operations that I wasn't cleared to understand, and his presence at this meeting meant Elena's case had reached the highest levels of military leadership. Colonel Martinez, Mrs. Martinez, I want you to understand that what happened to your family represents a failure of our support systems for military dependents. Elena Rodriguez should have been identified and neutralized as a threat to military families years ago. The general's direct acknowledgement of institutional responsibility felt both surprising and reassuring. Military leadership is taking ownership of the security gap that allowed Elena to target multiple families without facing serious consequences.
We're implementing new protocols for background checks on family members who request access to military housing or support services, General Morrison continued. Elena's pattern of behavior will be used as a case study for training military family advocacy personnel and security officials. David straightened slightly in his chair. General Morrison, what assurances can you provide about Emma's ongoing safety? Elena Rodriguez will never have unsupervised access to military families again, General Morrison replied, with the kind of finality that suggested decisions had been made at levels far above local family services. The measures being implemented will ensure that anyone with Elena's profile and history will be flagged immediately if they attempt to target military dependents. The general paused, his expression becoming more personal. Colonel Martinez, your quick recognition of the threat Elena posed and your decisive action to protect your family prevented what could have been years of additional psychological damage. Your response will be used as a model for other military families facing similar situations. As we prepared to leave the Pentagon that afternoon, I reflected on how completely our understanding of Elena's behavior had changed over the past 3 days. What had started as family conflict over parenting approaches had revealed itself to be a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare against military families. Elena's decision to hit Emma had it been a momentary loss of control, it had been the culmination of months of systematic manipulation designed to establish her complete authority over Emma's care while undermining my confidence as a mother. But Elena had made a critical miscalculation when she'd chosen to target the family of a Pentagon chief of staff. David's position and resources had allowed us to respond to her threat with the full weight of military and federal authority, ensuring not only Emma's protection, but the protection of other military families who might have become Elena's future targets. Walking out of the Pentagon that afternoon, holding David's hand while we discussed picking up Emma from her playdate, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Elena had moved in with us 8 months earlier. Complete security in our family's stability and safety. Elena's war against military families was over, and she had lost decisively. But more importantly, Emma was safe. Our marriage had been strengthened by the crisis, and other military families would be protected from experiencing the psychological manipulation and family destruction that Elena had perfected over years of targeting vulnerable service members. The birthday party that had started as a celebration and turned into a nightmare had ultimately become the catalyst for justice that extended far beyond our personal situation. Elena had finally faced an opponent with the resources and authority to ensure she could never harm another family again. 6 months after Elena's removal from our home, I found myself standing in a federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, watching as justice was finally served for the systematic destruction she had inflicted on military families across 2 decades. Elena sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, her once defiant posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who had finally been forced to confront the consequences of her actions. The psychological evaluation had determined her competent to stand trial, but the months in federal custody had clearly taken their toll on someone who had spent years believing she was above accountability. The defendant has pleaded guilty to charges of systematic harassment of military families, child endangerment, aggravated assault on a minor, and conspiracy to interfere with military family stability, announced Judge Patricia Reeves, a federal judge who specialized in cases involving threats to military personnel. The court has reviewed the extensive evidence of the defendant's pattern of targeting vulnerable military families over a period of 17 years. David sat beside me in the gallery, wearing his dress uniform as both a show of respect for the proceedings and a symbol of the military families Elena had targeted. Emma was at school, living the normal life of a 4-year-old who had processed her trauma with remarkable resilience, thanks to ongoing counseling and the security of knowing she was protected by people who took her safety seriously. Behind us sat representatives from the other military families Elena had destroyed. Marcus Rodriguez, whose marriage had ended because of Elena's interference, Colonel Patricia Hayes, who had nearly left the military because of Elena's manipulation, and Maria Santos, who had traveled from California to witness Elena's accountability for the psychological damage that had led to her suicide attempt. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Judge Reeves addressed Elena directly, "your actions represent one of the most systematic campaigns of psychological warfare against military families that this court has encountered. You deliberately targeted families during their most vulnerable periods, exploited their need for support, and caused psychological damage that, in some cases, lasted for years." Elena's attorney, a public defender who had tried unsuccessfully to negotiate a plea deal that would have avoided federal prison time, remained silent as the judge continued with the sentencing phase. "The evidence shows that you specifically sought out military families dealing with deployment separation, loss, or trauma, then systematically undermined family relationships while positioning yourself as an indispensable authority figure. Your actions were not the result of poor judgment or family dysfunction. They were calculated psychological attacks designed to cause maximum damage to military readiness and family stability." Agent Walsh, who had become the lead federal investigator on what was now called Operation Family Shield, had briefed me the previous week on the final scope of their investigation. Elena's activities had been even more extensive than initially discovered, with evidence of attempted contact with over 40 military families across multiple states. "The defendant's pattern shows clear escalation over time," Agent Walsh had explained. "Elena learned from each family she targeted, refining her methods and developing more sophisticated approaches to psychological manipulation. By the time she targeted your family, she had perfected techniques that had taken her nearly 2 decades to develop."
The investigation had also revealed that Elena had been documenting her successes in detailed journals that read like a tactical manual for destroying military families. She had recorded which approaches were most effective for different types of family stress, how to identify and exploit specific vulnerabilities, and how to avoid detection while maximizing psychological damage. Elena kept meticulous records of every family she targeted, Agent Walsh had continued. She analyzed what worked, what didn't, and how to improve her methods for future operations. The journals show clear intent to cause harm rather than provide help. Dr. Thompson, the military psychologist who had analyzed Elena's methods, had testified during the trial about the sophisticated nature of Elena's psychological manipulation techniques. Elena Rodriguez demonstrated advanced understanding of military family dynamics, stress patterns, and psychological vulnerabilities. Her approach was methodical, strategic, and designed to cause lasting psychological damage. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from multiple military families, psychological experts, and federal investigators. Each day had revealed new details about Elena's systematic approach to targeting and destroying military family relationships. Marcus Rodriguez had testified about how Elena's interference had led to his divorce and eventual departure from military service. Elena convinced my wife that I was a dangerous person who should not have access to our children when I returned from deployment, he had told the court. By the time I came home, Elena had destroyed my marriage and turned my own children against me. Colonel Patricia Hayes had described how Elena had nearly convinced her to abandon her military career during the most vulnerable period of her life. Elena exploited my grief over my husband's death and my concerns about single motherhood to convince me that I was harming my son by remaining in the military. I almost gave up everything I had worked for because Elena made me believe I was a failure as a mother. Maria Santos had provided perhaps the most powerful testimony about Elena's psychological manipulation techniques. Elena gradually convinced me that I was an inadequate mother who was damaging my children through my parenting choices. She made me believe that my children would be better off without me. Elena's psychological manipulation nearly cost me my life. Throughout the trial, Elena had maintained her position that she had been providing necessary guidance to families who needed help with child rearing and household management.
even when confronted with evidence of the psychological damage she had caused, Elena had insisted that her interventions had been appropriate and that the families had been ungrateful for her assistance. The defendant's complete lack of remorse and continued insistence that her behavior was appropriate demonstrates the ongoing threat she poses to military families. Prosecutor Jennifer Chen had argued during closing statements, Elena Rodriguez is not someone who made mistakes or exercised poor judgment. She is someone who developed a systematic method for destroying military families and feels no responsibility for the devastating consequences of her actions. Judge Reeves had spent considerable time reviewing the extensive documentation of Elena's pattern before announcing her sentencing decision. Elena Rodriguez, this court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 10 years of supervised probation with restrictions on contact with military families. You will be required to undergo psychological counseling throughout your incarceration and probation period, though the court notes that your psychological evaluations suggest limited likelihood of rehabilitation. The sentence was more severe than Elena's attorney had expected, but it reflected the federal government's recognition that Elena's activities had posed a genuine threat to military readiness and national security. Additionally, Judge Reeves continued, you are permanently banned from all military installations, prohibited from initiating contact with military families, and required to register your address with federal authorities for the remainder of your life. Any violation of these restrictions will result in immediate reincarceration. Elena's face remained impassive as the sentence was pronounced, but I could see the reality of 15 years in federal prison finally registering. She would be 73 years old when released, and her ability to target vulnerable families would be permanently curtailed by federal monitoring and restrictions. As the court session concluded and Elena was led away in shackles, I felt a profound sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The woman who had terrorized our family and destroyed so many others would finally face consequences proportional to the damage she had caused. Outside the courthouse, David and I were approached by Captain Rodriguez, who had continued to serve as military family advocate throughout the investigation and trial process. Mrs. Martinez, I wanted you to know that the Pentagon has officially implemented the Elena Rodriguez protocols for screening family members who request access to military housing and support services. Your family's experience has led to systematic changes that will protect military families from this type of targeting in the future. The knowledge that Emma's traumatic birthday party had ultimately led to protections for other military children felt like meaningful justice beyond Elena's individual punishment. Dr. Thompson joined our conversation to provide an update on the ongoing support services for Elena's victims. We've established a specialized counseling program for military families affected by systematic psychological manipulation. The program has helped over 30 families process the trauma Elena caused and rebuild their relationships and confidence. Marcus Rodriguez approached us as we prepared to leave the courthouse. Rebecca, David, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to fight back against Elena when she targeted your family. If you hadn't acted so decisively, she would have continued destroying families for years. His words reminded me of how different the outcome could have been if David hadn't used his position and resources to respond comprehensively to Elena's threat. Many families didn't have access to Pentagon-level support and had been left to deal with Elena's manipulation through inadequate local family services.
Maria Santos also expressed gratitude for our role in finally stopping Elena's destructive activities. Knowing that Elena will never be able to target another military family gives me peace that I haven't felt since she nearly destroyed my life 10 years ago, she said. As David and I drove home from the courthouse, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed since that terrible birthday party 8 months earlier. Emma was thriving in preschool. Our marriage had been strengthened by navigating the crisis together, and our family felt more secure and stable than it had in years. Rebecca, do you ever regret how we handled the situation with Elena? David asked as we pulled into our driveway. I thought about the question seriously. Elena's removal from our home had led to family estrangement, federal investigation, and ultimately her imprisonment. The consequences had been severe and permanent, affecting not just Elena, but extended family members who had been forced to choose sides in a situation they didn't fully understand. "I regret that it came to this," I said finally. "I regret that Elena chose to target military families and cause so much damage over so many years. But I don't regret protecting Emma and other children from someone who had demonstrated both the willingness and the ability to cause serious psychological harm." That evening, as Emma played happily in our living room while David and I prepared dinner together, I felt grateful for the institutional support that had allowed us to protect our family so comprehensively. Emma's trauma had healed with remarkable speed once she felt secure that the person who had hurt her could never reach her again. "Mommy, can we have another birthday party this year?" Emma asked as she arranged her toys in elaborate scenarios that involved princesses saving other children from dragons. "Of course we can, sweetheart. What kind of party would you like?" "A party where everyone is safe and happy," Emma said, with the kind of wisdom that children sometimes display when they've processed difficult experiences successfully. "That sounds like the perfect kind of party," I agreed. Looking back on everything that had happened since Elena slapped Emma at her third birthday party, I understood that our family's experience had been about much more than protecting one child from an inappropriate grandmother. It had been about recognizing and responding to systematic threats to military family stability, ensuring accountability for psychological manipulation and abuse, and creating protections that would benefit countless families in the future. Elena's reign of terror against military families was over, and she would spend the next 15 years learning that there were finally consequences for targeting the people who served our country and their loved ones. Emma was safe, other military children were protected, and justice had been served at the highest levels of federal authority. The birthday party that had started as a celebration and become a nightmare had ultimately led to the kind of justice that ensured Elena would never harm another family again.